podcast, learning more, science, people, creativity, books, knowledge, expanding our framework. Glad to have you all on here as we continue into the months through 2024. On this wonderful episode here, we have the author of the book, Civic Solitude, Why Democracy Needs Distance. He is the W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy at Vanderbilt University. His research specializes in contemporary political philosophy with interest in democratic theory and political epistemology. Also pursues topics in pragmatism, analytic philosophy, argumentation theory, and ancient philosophy. My guest today is Professor Robert Talisse. Welcome to the show. I'm glad to have you on. You're at Vanderbilt University.
Vanderbilt University is a selective private university established by Cornelius Vanderbilt shortly after the Civil War. Cornelius Vanderbilt, you might know, is a Yankee from up north. He founded the ferries that travel around New York and the Long Island ferry in particular, and so made his living sort of in transportation, in part at least. And shortly after the Civil War, funded the founding of Vanderbilt in Nashville, in part as a private effort at helping Reconstruction along. The rationale offered for the gift to found the university was to create a university in the South that could attract people who otherwise would be at Yale or Harvard to go to this other part of the country. And it's a pretty elite place. The philosophy department has a nice PhD program, and generally a lot of places one can wind up as a philosopher that would be worse for me. How's that sound?
That's pretty cool. That's neat. So it fits that in that way.
Yeah.
Does it have, are there regions of the country that lend themselves more to peaceful, thoughtful nature versus too much hubbub that maybe lends itself a little bit more to thoughtfulness?
That's an interesting question. There might be, right? You might wonder if certain modes of philosophical activities, philosophical engagement, might lend themselves more readily, or might be more readily available to one in more urban settings or in more rural settings. I suspect that's probably true in some way. However, a lot of philosophy, at the very least, maybe reflective thinking more generally is the story might be different. But when it comes to philosophy, at least, philosophy involves modes of sort of self-reflection and contemplation, but philosophy also always is essentially dialogical. It involves talking to other people, whether you're arguing or explaining or sharing ideas or exploring thoughts with others. And so I suspect that there's a degree of togetherness among human beings that would obstruct philosophical thinking, because, as you say, lots of hubbub and there's a lot of noise, but and not a lot of dialogue, but certainly a lot of I'm from New Jersey, a lot of get out of my way, and maybe LA isn't that much different in that regard, and so maybe there's an environmental cost to it being too busy, but I think that there's philosophy, I think, would be very, very difficult without others around to disagree with, or to trade ideas with, or to explore thinking with. And so I don't know. There must be a sweet spot. I don't know what it would be.
It's like that bliss point where they have like between sweet and salty that companies use for there's a sweet spot for this as well.
Yeah,
That's
I'm sure
interesting.
there's something like that. I just, we make do with what we've got. We find community, philosophical community where we can, and we also establish establish boundaries.
Makes sense. You mentioned that philosophy involves reasoned argument and putting it together. The first chapter of your book is putting together the argument you're presenting in this book. How important is it that we as people have logical, reasoned argument with one another in a calm state where it's like, oh, this is this point and this is that point and it's figured out through? How important is that as compared with a more impassioned, argumentative state?
Right.
Or are those both fine in some way?
Well, you know, I'm tempted to say that they're both needed, but let me flesh that out a little bit. I happen to not be. I'm a democratic theorist. I'm a believer in democracy, and it's not uncommon among democratic theorists and some democratic partitioners, people who are invested in the project of trying to help communities sort of, rekindle their commitment to democracy or engage better as democratic citizens. It's not uncommon in those communities for theorists and practitioners to draw the kind of distinction that you just drew between properly democratic dialogue, which is often described as lacking a certain kind of heat, as polite, as calm, and concessive and congenial. It's a lot of C words. But and then it's common for practitioners and theorists of democracy to characterize communicative exchanges that are impassioned, that involve some heat, that are animated, that might involve some acrimony or animosity even, as improper or not properly democratic or not, as signaling that democracy is broken down in some way. Now, and I'll concede to these practitioners and theorists that democratic dialogue can't be an exchange where we just holler at one another. So, name calling, hollering, trying to humiliate and put down the other side, I agree, that doesn't look properly democratic to me. However, remember, in a democracy, it's our job, part of our job as citizens is to take responsibility for the political world that we are in part co-authors of or partners in creating. And political issues are, not all political issues, but mostly political issues are momentous. They invoke big ideas about freedom and justice and equality and human dignity and autonomy. And so political debates are often debates about things that really matter, that are things that are really important. Now, I think it would be very, very odd as a democratic theorist for one to say, when people debate these very important issues, they shouldn't be impassioned, or they shouldn't be animated, or they shouldn't raise their voice. So my view is that, democratic debate is debate about stuff that's really important. Really important debates are impassioned debates, debates in which people are right to feel invested in and are right to be animated when they're disagreeing with one another about these issues. Where I think things start to go dysfunctional or pathological is when our investment in questions about equality and dignity and autonomy and justice reaches the level where we are no longer willing to recognize those among our fellow citizens with whom we disagree about those matters as people who are worth listening to or engaging with. And we start seeing our fellow citizens who don't agree with us about these issues as mere obstacles to be overcome. That's when the passion and the animus and the heat becomes democratically pathological. But I think that, again, your listeners might not only have detected that I'm from New Jersey, but I also grew up, well, they probably wouldn't have detected this. I grew up in a family of Arabs. And on my father's side, and loud debate about politics as I grew up, in my grandparents and in my aunt and uncle's houses was, par for the course. It was just part of what happened at dinner was, people, got loud. And it never struck me, and still doesn't strike me, that there was anything improper from the democratic point of view about all of that animation. Even if sometimes it did get a little bit acrimonious. Even if sometimes it did involve, one person calling the other person mad, nuts, crazy, uninformed, ignorant. Because what was driving the exchange, even when it got heated in these ways, was a deep commitment to trying better to understand the issue over which the disagreement was, over which we were disagreeing. And the understanding was always part of understanding what justice is, involves giving a full hearing, even to views about the nature of justice that you are convinced are mistaken. Part of what justice requires is, right, in a democracy, part of what justice requires in a democracy is recognizing the deep political commitment that I think is at the heart of democracy. Being right about justice doesn't mean you get your way. Being wrong about justice doesn't mean you don't have a political say. That despite the substantive merits of our various opinions about justice and injustice and freedom and oppression and all the rest, we still maintain our civic status as democratic partners. And that you're right and the other guy's wrong doesn't mean the other guy has to shut up. Democracy is never having to shut up. That is a deep, I think, commitment and I think interesting political insight in democracy, that as long as we don't lose sight of that the people who we are convinced are wrong about politics are nonetheless our civic partners, then I'm willing to say, let the debates get as hot as anybody wants, as long as they're consistent with treating your interlocutor in a way that acknowledges that they are fundamentally your civic partner. So I think political debate can get very animated. Does that make sense?
This is a great point, and it's got many layers to it, because so passion by itself is not an issue. Actually, it's a good thing because you're connecting with things you really care about and that are important. It's only when it goes to the point that the passion is directed at like squashing the other individual. Now your passion is no longer connected to the argument. Now it's like me versus that person. It's so small. It's very small. And then we don't want lack of passion, because that's like a lack of interest in total. That's almost like a encyclopedia, which is good too. I'm more like an encyclopedia, but I get that you don't want it to just, because if you really care about something, you would have a lot of energy you would bring to it usually.
Yeah, and the issues are important. So, I mean, it would be very, very peculiar to say
Right.
the most important questions we can ask about how we live together are questions about which nobody gets to raise his or her voice. It just strikes me as deeply, deeply implausible. Right? It's like the importance of the issues requires that you do kind of what I'm doing now. Right? You get a little bit into it. Right? It would be very, very peculiar otherwise. Very peculiar.
It's true. We want to make our points in such a way. And then to stick to the concept of what you're trying to get across, working for both sides, not discounting the other end completely from scratch. I see a lot, like a lot of different types of discussion all over the internet, and very little falls into the category that we're describing here. It would be nice if it was larger, the amount that's in this category of two people. Okay, here's my viewpoint. Oh, that's yours. This is what I think about this. Oh, you think that. Okay. I see where you're coming from. You care about this. Like like a furtherance. I rarely see a furtherance. So that's a little disappointing. But
Yeah,
these are the things these are the things that are very important for it to be fruitful versus a like, oh, okay, victory, and now I go that way. It's
I
like,
mean,
oh,
even
now
the language that we use when we're talking, Armin, about what goes on in social media and other kinds of online spaces is deeply at odds with the democratic idea. Think about like what we do when we talk about owning the other side, right? It's all about shutting down the interlocutor, putting the interlocutor in his or her place, all for the purpose, ultimately not of teaching the interlocutor anything. You're playing to an onlooking audience always on social media. Everything that's engaged in social media is for the sake of an onlooking audience of people who are following you because they want to see you own the other side. It's a deeply anti-democratic set of norms, owning the other side, shutting them down, right? If you go look on your social media feed today, especially because we've got a debate coming up very soon, the shutting down language, right? She torched him is, I understand that presidential politics, large-scale politics, is all about performance. I get that. I don't, so that the candidates are doing this is not a surprise to me, and maybe not even objectionable in my view. But that so much of the conversation that goes on online among the citizens follows this model of shutting down the other side, leaving the other side speechless, not coming to better understand the issues, but merely providing for one's political allies a clear signal that we're in the right and that we don't have to do any more thinking about this because look at how I just owned Ben Shapiro or whoever it is, right? It's like this is a deeply anti-democratic mode of political communication that democracy welcomes or invites or in some ways permits and maybe even enables. But again, because it's not tethered to this more fundamental commitment of civic partnership, it gets very dysfunctional very, very quickly. I think it's bad democratic politics. And I'll say this, I think it's bad democratic politics. And it strikes me as all the more lamentable, all the more problematic when this mode of political communication is enacted by the people who I happen to think are on the right side of the issue. It's like it's even more objectionable. It's like you've got the right view about the political questions. I hope your side wins the election. It drives me nuts to see you engaging in such a way that is fundamentally at odds with the idea of equal citizenship, even among people that's so fundamentally invested in the idea that if you're wrong about politics, you're just an obstacle.
I like solid points here. I like the point you brought up of less thinking involved. It's like, okay, look, now that I've crushed this individual, me and my crew no longer have to think. Our prefrontal cortex can take a breather again for the next however long because we didn't want to think in the first place. Let's keep our glucose stores high and or whatever amount there is because thinking is not preferred. There's a clear like thinking is not preferred message that is out there in some form. Like, look, I got us. We have another 4 days where we can just coast on like we are good to go. And I've never been fond of that because what is our being here on? That's a good chunk of our ability is thinking, working through issues. It's like our opposable thumb gives us great advantage. Same thing, our thinking gives us great advantage.
And opposable rationality too.
That's a good point. That's a good point. It's connected that way.
That's right. And notice, one of the things that comes out in the book is that, our political coalitions are groups of allies, even when we've got really good reasons for our political views, even when we're on the right side of the issues. Our political coalitions stand in constant danger of escalating conformity pressures. And so part of what's going on social media political discourse and discourse elsewhere, it's not just an internet problem, by the way, is that our engagements with our opposition is always in this mode of shutting down, humiliating, owning them, so that we can present ourselves as legitimate allies to our to those with whom we agree about the politics. But like-minded groups become homogeneous groups. Like-minded groups become expandingly homogeneous. That is that groups of this is just empirical stuff, right? Groups of like-minded people, once they come to see themselves as an alliance, as a like-minded group, they become increasingly invested in being a group, which is good social psychology here. This is it's even intuitive, right? Yeah, as you come to see yourself as a group, you become more invested in being a group. Think about sports fans, a very good example of this. Like once groups of people come to see themselves as fans of the same sports team, they become interested in being more group-like with one another. And so, this is why, I'm old enough to remember a time when I was young that it wasn't so easy to get merch for your favorite sports team. There wasn't like New York Giants socks and neckties and caps and jackets. Like you could get like a jersey or something, but it wasn't like they weren't merched to the max. Now they are, because when you see yourself as a fan, it's like you want to find ways to connect with other fans. And that means like wearing the New York Giants tie or the cap or the bumper sticker or whatever it is a way of signaling to your potential allies, hey, I'm one of you. As groups political groups in particular, become more and more invested in being group-like, they become more and more conformist internally. So we agree on immigration, or we agree on taxation, we agree on some set of political issues that makes us sort of political allies. As you and I, Armin, come to see ourselves as members of the same political group, what happens is that the group becomes more and more invested in policing the boundary between the group and the in-group and the out-group. What does that mean? More and more behavior, more and more groupish conforming behavior is expected of members of the group. What does that mean? The group becomes more and more reliant on a hierarchical structure where people at the top get to set the expectations. You want to be, you don't want to be a rhino, you want to be a real Republican, you got to wear a red hat now. You got to have an AR-15 lapel pin now, right? You've got to say, let's go Brandon now. So the group, as it becomes more and more coalesced as a group, also becomes more conformist. Now just think about what this means when we're talking about political coalitions that see themselves as radically democratic and progressive and invested in, expanding the franchise and making society more and more egalitarian. Political goals that I'm very sympathetic with, by the way. Like, yeah, those groups are internally not egalitarian. They're hierarchical. They become increasingly intolerant of disagreement among allies. So they become more and more conformist. And here's one last sort of very disconcerting empirical finding called the black sheep effect. We have more intensely negative, punitive, punishing attitudes towards perceived fakers, posers, than the negative and punitive attitudes we have towards our outright foes. So when we out somebody as a fake progressive, as a rhino, or whatever it is, that sets that person up for even more hate than the hate the group shows for the people who are their actual opponents. That's how deep the conformity pressures sort of lie. Like, that's how deeply invested the homogeneity goes. And this is all democratically quite dysfunctional.
It's very notable to me. That's true, because the foe is over there, and you can say that's my foe, clearly our enemy, easy as pie to point out we are opposed to that, and we're not even around them, so we're not feeling too much. Same thing happens kind of with family structure, but within, if there's somebody that's something, oh, okay, oh, that's slimy. Wait a minute, you're that oh, you're treating them more foe-like than the actual supposed foe, which is way over there, 20 miles, 100 miles away, or whatever it is, internet-wise. The close individuals get some of the most heated punch factor based on that. You're not blending in with. We started to put these criteria. Now we're limiting in some way. We were more, at the beginning, maybe more unlimited in our thinking. We had a couple of things, but as time goes on, now there's more structure, and it's got to fit all these 14 things. Oh, you don't fit all these 14 things. Well, now we have an issue of sorts, because I agree with all the 14. I stopped thinking at number 8. The last 6, I just said, let's go with it, whatever that is.
That's right.
What a dynamic.
Yeah, very, very, very dangerous in a democratic polity. I'll tell one very quick story. A friend of mine in Brooklyn told me when I was working on some of these issues that wind up in the book. She had founded or helped to found a community organization that was invested in teaching self-defense to women and children in parts of the city where there were high levels of known to be high levels of domestic violence and abuse. And the group was wildly successful for the first several months and started enlisting the talents of other self-defense instructors. Very shortly, it became a victim of its own success. Very quickly, it became a victim of its own success, in part because the instructors, the leadership and the instructors, the volunteers of the group, started disagreeing about the broader commitments of the group. And so they started having, conflicts over issues like the following. Well, we're teaching women and young girls self-defense. That makes us a feminist group. So part of the self-defense training, shouldn't that be training in feminist theory? Maybe, again, not yet, doesn't seem to me to be yet objectionable. So that was one sort of so part of the self-defense training then started to involve, or it was claimed that it should start to involve sort of training in feminist resistance practices, broader feminist social theory. Okay. Then next move became, we're really, in being a self-defense group serving this particular population, given its own feminist commitments, we're really an anti-violence group. And so part of the training also should be about violence against non-human animals. So maybe we're also a vegan group. Now, your reaction, Armin, I think this is a pattern that I think is will be recognizable to anybody who's been invested and involved in social movement building, social organizing, all the rest. Is that when you touch on something that's successful, it's very natural for the group to start thinking about the parameters of its remit, its purpose, its aims. But think of the black sheep effect again came into play. The group couldn't survive the disagreements and wound up very quickly dissolving, which is a shame in a way, because okay, now nobody gets the self-defense training, right? Because they couldn't agree about whether the veganism, the feminist social resistance components were strictly necessary from the point of view of the self-defense training. In fact, they were saying they're necessary. We're not just treating people how to fight. We have to be treating them how to fight on the basis of a broader theory of women's liberation, right? Of overcoming oppression. And in a way, I can understand how these arguments would work. I get it. I'm not even saying this is just saying it's a dynamic that infects like-minded groups, and having good political opinions does not render your political coalition immune to these dynamics that ultimately are dysfunctional.
I feel that one. I've seen that many a time. It's like an overreach. Oh well, we do this now. We're also we make pencils, but we will save the planet with making. Wait, what? How'd you just reached over and now we're okay? Yeah. But you were 2 minutes ago. You were making pencils. So it is good to have. I've seen any successful thing that lasts in the long term has a real base and then carefully adds elements. It's like the same thing as the PhD world or knowledge. Knowledge is there, and then a PhD is a little adjustment to what we have, expanding on what we've already gotten. It's not like, oh, here was the knowledge that we all had, everything, this is the globe of knowledge. It's just a big part of this. What thing? What is the... No, there's no... We have this, and we're going to... I've never seen the alternative work. It sounds great at first, because it sounds like somebody just figured out something beyond all of what everybody else has been doing.
Very, very difficult to keep those constraints, those guardrails in place, though. A very difficult one, especially when you're talking about these big, momentous, important issues where we have a tendency, and it seems to me to be totally plausible to think that it's a good thing when all of our political judgments are systematic, so that our view about the environment, our view about immigration, our view about globalization, our view about incarceration, all fit together, hang together in a way that gives them a kind of cohesion, so that you can explain the one partly in terms of the others and all the rest. That's just, a good aim of trying to think systematically about things, is to have all of the good thoughts sort of hang together in a way. That's right. But when we're talking about political action, it looks to me it's got to be much more piecemeal. It's like today, this group is trying to stage an intervention in domestic violence. That's what we're doing. On some day, we might be able to discuss the way that that project is integrally related with broader aims of feminist resistance and overcoming oppression and dismantling the carceral system and all the it might be connected in all those ways. For practical purposes, though, we're doing this thing now. It's very, very hard to maintain that stance given the draw of the systematicity of one's political, normative, moral views. It's very hard to stay focused on a single thing and not let the big picture come in and become part of your understanding of what the group is. Does that sound right?
I see this also as less of an issue with individuals who are bigger picture their whole life, such that it's not so momentous moment, like, oh, this is what, but then the individual that may not be thinking bigger picture most of their life and gets a glimmer of like, feeling like they are presenting something bigger picture, suddenly it's this very quick short term, oh, we will, this is, and it's so stupendous, whereas the person who maybe thinks bigger picture their whole life, be like, I don't, or you, this is just a, seems like a 1 week thing. Let's just write it out in that way.
Right.
Wherever you are consistent is the, like a mechanic that's consistent for many years, okay, and that's reliable, and that's what person who's bigger picture for many years, reliable for that. But to switch them now, odd and kind of odd.
Yeah, no, that sounds right.
I wanted to throw this in there before I point out or bring up Solitude, because I want to mention that about your book. But back to the crush concept, I like that we just mentioned the web of thoughts, because let's say somehow, just for entertainment purposes, I'd like to point out how hilarious it is in a way. So we are having a very, I think, valuable and viable discussion, and this is the web of our thoughts. Somehow now I crush you on some point. Oh, Robert was crushed. Great, I crushed this half of thoughts. What's my celebration? Like now I go walk off. I lost a good chunk of connectivity of thoughts. I go over there. We both lost. I don't get it. That one, it's an amazing, such a short-term thought pattern. I lost too, because it's not like I'm crushing a part of this web was part of me now, and I lost that web too. I go crushed. I'm crushed as well. It's hefty.
Yeah.
I thought I'd bring that up.
Yeah, no, and you know, I don't think it's. I think it's actually rather intuitive and not a deep philosophical insight. Although you can find philosophers, expounding on it in ways that are deep and philosophical. I think it's a pretty intuitive insight that in order to fully understand our own minds, the contents of our own thinking, we need friction, right? We need pushback. We need other people. It's almost like what happens at the gym? You lift weights, right? You get resistance is the way that you build your body, right? Well, cognitive fitness is not that much different. In order to fully get a command of your own mind, you need friction from others. You need other people to give you pushback. Not because you have to adopt the idea like, oh, who's to say they might be right? It's like, no, maybe at the end of the day, Armin, your views are all correct. The value of the pushback is when you get pushback, you come to better appreciate the reasons that can be brought in defense of your view. You might never have to change your mind about anything, but the pushback helps you better grasp, better capture the grounds for the correctness of your view. It's very, very difficult. The kind of complex, dynamic cognitive creatures that we are. Very difficult to hold on to. Not the commitments that we have. We're good at holding on to the commitments. It's very hard to hold on to our grasp of the grounds of those commitments, the reasons, the arguments, the evidence. That's the thing that's the cognitive muscle that needs exercise. And if you're talking only to people who agree with you, or if you're not talking to anybody who gives you any friction, any pushback, that cognitive muscle decays, it atrophies. And then you wind up, even with somebody who's got a bunch of true beliefs, you don't understand what makes them true, the reasons that can be offered to defend them. And that makes you a very easy mark for somebody to just, for somebody to manipulate. You become easier to manipulate when you don't understand the basis for your beliefs.
This is very true. It's important for us to sharpen the why we do things, why they understand. Sharpen that part. Need to bounce back on that. Like,
that's right.
Hitting against a concrete pillar or a glass. Okay, it's tough. Okay, it's got strength. Yeah. Very important concept. The idea of solitude, being with oneself or thinking in that way, why is that important for some of these democratic ideals we are representing to take place? And how can what does solitude look like?
Good. So the book is called Civic Solitude, Why Democracy Needs Distance. You can read a lot about democracy from practitioners, organizers, philosophers, political scientists, who will give you a picture of democracy that's not inaccurate. I'm going to say it's incomplete. It's not inaccurate. Democracy is the people, or some collection, some group of people who are citizens, publicly taking responsibility for their politics, holding the government to account, having their voices heard. If you do a Google search for "this is what democracy looks like," you're going to instantly get a couple 100,000 pictures showing roughly the same thing. A mass of people in a public space communicating a common political message to some government agency or to the broader society at large. That is what democracy looks like. Not denying that. It's not the only thing that democracy looks like, though. And here's the reason why. For some of the reasons that we were just speaking of a moment ago, group dynamics foul our judgments, even when we have good judgment, right? So, what if it turns out that collective public action with like-minded others tends to weaken or dilute certain cognitive capacities that are really important for good democracy? What if that were true? The Civic Solitude book tries to go through some empirical data. Some of it, I think, is pretty overwhelming. It's at the very least, I think, persuasive. Maybe it's more like decisive. I see it as decisive. Some empirical findings that suggest that mass public action among like-minded people undercuts our cognitive and emotional capacities to treat our fellow citizens with whom we don't agree as our civic partners. Now, if you think like me, that democracy is the aspiration to create, pursue, build, work towards a society of self-governing political equals. That's what I think democracy is. I can defend that if you want, but that's just my brass tacks. Democracy is a kind of project. It's an aspiration. It's not merely a form of government. It's not merely a set of institutions. It's the aspiration that makes sense of those institutions in that form of government. Why do we have elections? Why do we have term limits? Why do we have elected officials? Why do we have a constitution? Well, because we're a society that's invested in creating a certain kind of political order. What kind of political order? A political order of self-governing equals. That's what the society is aiming for. It falls short, but that's what it's aiming for. Now, I want to suggest that when you do that Google search, you see that mass of people out in front of the White House carrying signs. That is part of democracy. But if that's all we think of as democracy, we are engaged in, we are welcoming, we are failing to adequately recognize what I think is a kind of strain or conflict within democracy. Not in a way that makes some other mode of political organization preferable. I'm a Democrat. I'm a real believer in democracy. I want to say that democracy asks us to do different things that aren't so easy to do together. One is the collective, public, taking responsibility, speaking truth to power, calling to account, holding accountable of the seats of power. Yes. Democracy also, though, needs us to be reflective. We need an active citizenry and engaged citizenry. Citizens also have to be reflective. And it turns out that collective public action erodes some of the reflective capacities that democratic citizens need. The proposal then for what I call civic solitude is to introduce into our democratic vocabulary, into our thinking, into our idiom of good citizenship, modes of civic political reflection that are distanced from our allies and foes, are distanced from the political fray of the moment, the fight over immigration, the fight over military spending, the fight over policing in our cities, steps back from that and engages with political ideas, political debates, political questions that are not fully legible to us as 2024 democratic citizens. Let me put it in a way that's slightly sloganistic. I think this is in the book, right? It's really important for democratic citizens to occasionally remind themselves that the categories, the vocabulary, the fissures of contemporary democratic politics in the United States are all contingent features of our politics. That doesn't mean they're not important. It means that the distinction between Republicans and Democrats, left wing and right wing, these are fluid. These are the products of political social contingencies. And that democracy sometimes, and I would like to suggest there's reason to think that we are currently as a society, maybe as a collection of democratic societies, at a juncture where the political vernacular that we have inherited from political battles going back, in the United States case, to the 80s, by the way. That's where current configurations of Republicans and Democrats sort of started coming so to be central to our understanding with Reagan primarily. Like that vocabulary, that idiom is insufficient to enable us to think seriously about policy, about some very, very pressing issues, including, as I've been mentioning, immigration, the environment, right? We don't have the political conceptual tools to think clearly about these issues. It's not that we're groping in the dark. It's that we don't have we have tools that were fashioned under different circumstances for different purposes. Sometimes we need to think, if it weren't such a cliche, to think outside the box. But sometimes we need to forge new conceptual tools. And insofar as our political thinking is so tightly tethered to the fray of the moment, the political struggles of the day, which we can't abandon. I'm not saying like politics today is small potatoes. It's important. We need to find ways to create the conditions under which we can exercise our imaginations independently of the fissures and the conflicts of our political present, so that we can start thinking in political terms that will enable us in the future to better understand the issues and challenges that we currently face. Because the tools that we're using right now, Republicans and Democrats, just not cutting it, not enabling us to. Here's one reason to think this is true. Let me just say one very quick thing. It seems very clear to me, and maybe this is intuitive enough that when I say it, you won't get too much pushback, that whatever the environmental crisis is, it's a crisis that's not bound by the nation state. The environmental crisis is not a crisis in the U.S. and in France and in Pakistan and in New Zealand. It's not, the challenge is not bound by the domain of the nation state, which is a domain within geographical borders, within a territory. The environmental crisis is not bound by any particular territory, like the nation state and its jurisdiction are. If we think about the environmental crisis from the point of view of policies by the nation state, we're going to fall short, it seems to me. So we need but we don't have the political vocabulary to talk about global policy issues because we don't have a global state or a global territory. Now, I'm not making the case for a global state. I'm saying that we need to forge conceptual, philosophical tools that can help us think about policy challenges that don't stop at the borders of the nations. And we don't have them yet. How are we going to get them? Not by, not by trying to own the libs or, humiliate Ted Cruz online. That's not how we're going to do it. How are we going to do it? We need to start expanding our political imaginations beyond our political present. We need to come to realize that democracy is a long game. It's not always about us. It is about us in the sense that we're the voters, we're the people right now. But democracy is always a forward-looking project where we're the custodians of a political order to be inherited by a generation that does not yet exist. And we need to develop conceptual tools for thinking about our responsibility to those future generations. And we don't currently have them. And unless we can find contexts where we can take a step back, detach from the fray, be out of sight of our homogenizing, conformity insisting allies and our animosity raising foes, and think the political world in unfamiliar terms. Try to think new thoughts about politics. I think democracy we're not succeeding at carrying forward the democratic aspiration. I'll put it that way. And in order to do those things, we need places where we can engage in that kind of reflection and imaginative thinking. So the book ends on a defense of expanding public access to libraries, museums, and parks. Non-commercial spaces, so you're not being advertised to. Places where it's possible to be alone with your thoughts and maybe to encounter in a painting that looks weird to you, in a book written by an ancient Greek named Aristotle, encounter political ideas and sentiments that are relevant to the present precisely because they're so not of our time, and stimulate the imagination a little bit. How does that sound?
That sounds, I have to be more like passionate and difficult. That sounds terrible. No, short-term thoughts only. Short-term thoughts only. No, that sounds super duper. You made me think of the concept that a city is good when, I'm probably butchering it somehow, but if the shade of the trees that you sit under is because somebody 80 years ago planted that tree and they're no longer alive.
Yeah.
a long-term view in that way.
Yeah, we're
That is,
we're the custodians of an aspiration, not merely the co-creators of policies or the actors within institutional roles. We're carrying forward a project that started before us that will be inherited by people who, once they exist, will be our civic partners. They're no because they don't yet exist doesn't mean that they're any less important morally or civically speaking. They don't yet exist. They inherit the world that we help to create. We have to think of democracy in terms of the expanding authenticity of our democratic politics for generations to come.
it's a strong message. One last question I wanted to toss in there that I thought of a little bit. If someone is more intellectual or bigger picture thinking and clearly sees themselves in that space, would you suggest them to find themselves more around other more intellectual, bigger picture individuals, or just build their internal mindset landscape and pass on whatever they can to whoever may come across them?
Well, good. So let me just emphasize one thing that I don't think you were suggesting, but I just want to make sure. So the proposal for civic solitude is not the proposal that
Right.
get out of the streets
No,
and go
no,
into
no.
the libraries and being an avid library, a visitor who or a museum, somebody who lives, spends all day at the museum. That's the whole of your democratic duty. No, I want to suggest that your democratic duty involves all of the participatory group public activity that you are inclined to engage in if you're invested in democracy. But it also involves this additional thing. So in my view, the civic solitude view makes democracy more demanding than the activists say it is, right? The activist says, pick up a sign and go to the mall, go to the Washington Mall. That's democracy. That's part of democracy. Democracy also has to do with the kind of thinking and reflection and imagination that led to your picking up of the sign. Right? Okay, so now I think that part of what we need to do as citizens, if we thinking in big picture terms, if we're more focused on particular policy issues, I think that it behooves us as citizens in general to do a couple of different things, in addition to the solitude stuff, which is about expanding your imagination and all the rest. I think that it's worthwhile for citizens to find ways to maintain healthy political relations with people that they think are their opponents, not because democracy requires you to always be ready to consider the possibility that your opposition is right. I mean, maybe, depending on your commitments, maybe your opposition could be right. I don't know. But rather for this reason that we mentioned a little bit earlier, that in order to get full command of your own mind, you need to maintain the conditions under which there's an appropriate degree of friction. And surrounding yourself with your allies is a bad prescription for clear thinking about anything. And so finding ways to engage with your political opponents in ways that are civil, right? It doesn't have to be calm, but at least in ways that, as we started the conversation, expresses my recognition of the other person's partnership with me as a democratic citizen. I want to suggest that, political interactions across divides needn't always be interactions where we're trying to, I'm for gun control. You're against gun control. Let's hear the pro and con and, try to find the common ground between us and maybe compromise. Like some political, discussions can be like that. And if they're productive, I'm for them. But I want to say, look, here's another mode of engaging with the political opposition that's slightly different, but I think philosophically importantly different. Have the conversation with, you're into, you want stricter gun controls. The other guy is, a Second Amendment NRA guy or whatever. Ask that guy, what's the biggest weakness in my position? Now there, we're not trying to find the common ground. We're not trying to hear both sides. I'm trying to hear from you why you're not convinced by me. That doesn't put me, or doesn't require me to adopt the stance that, oh, maybe I'm wrong and they're right, or, ooh, maybe they have a point about, the virtues of an armed electorate. None of that. Just like, I think that, certain kinds of weapons ought to be criminal. Possession of certain kinds of weapons ought to be criminal. Ownership should be prohibited by law. Where am I wrong? That's just a different mode of interaction. And I think you can learn a lot that helps you better understand your own position from hearing where somebody on the other side thinks you're wrong. It's just good data. Last thing, because I think that there's one other thing, and this is the subject of a 2019 book. Civic Solitude is the third in a trilogy of books. And the 2019 book is called Overdoing Democracy. And the proposal that's made in that book, roughly beginning with the same diagnostic story, certain kinds of necessary democratic collective public activities can erode certain kinds of cognitive and emotive capacities that we need in order to do democracy well. And so part of what Overdoing Democracy argues is that, and with some sociological data, is that one of the things that's going on, or has been going on in our society since the 90s, is the proliferation of, or the saturation of politics into every aspect of our lives, such that now it's not an exaggeration or hyperbole to say that where you shop for your clothes, what kind of car you drive, the occupation you're in, your attitudes about whether you own a passport, for example. Whether you shop at a Target rather than a Walmart. These are all lifestyle choices that are now very tightly predictive of how you vote and your partisan affiliation. Republicans and Democrats in the United States today, not a stretch to say, live in different social worlds. That's not to say they have different kinds of friends. They eat different food, they watch different movies, they do different things for work, they decorate their houses in systematically different ways. More clocks in your home, the more likely you vote conservative. They buy coffee. You shop at Dunkin' Donuts rather than Starbucks. That code's the clientele of Dunkin' Donuts is heavily conservative. It goes the other way for Starbucks. Now, the infiltration of partisan affiliation into your kids play soccer, or do they play baseball or football? It's a good indication of how you vote. The proliferation of partisan identity into the whole of our lives is a relatively recent phenomenon. Let me mention one other data point on this. Negative attitudes towards cross-partisan marriage are notably, substantially more intense in the country than negative attitudes towards interfaith or interracial marriage. Now think about that for a second. Americans would rather see their kid marry someone who worships a false god than who votes for the wrong candidate. Now that's remarkable to me. But what's happened is that partisan identity has become our central mode of social identity, such that once you see yourself as an affiliate, once you identify as a Republican or a conservative or a Democrat or a progressive or a liberal, once you adopt a political identification for yourself, you're more likely to change religions in your lifetime than you are to change partisan affiliation in the United States right now. So I want to suggest that part of what the democratic aspiration asks of us is to reclaim parts of our social lives, of our lifestyles, for collective activities that are cooperative, in which we're not suppressing our political differences or keeping our partisan affiliation, at the door or whatever. We need to find ways to engage in activities together in which our political affiliation is simply irrelevant. And the fact that some of your listeners have heard me say that and felt like, what is he talking about? What could that be? I want to suggest, here's where we could end. That's a symptom of the problem. That's not a counterexample to my claim. That's a symptom. That we can't even imagine a world not already so thoroughly, completely structured around partisan identity is part of the problem.
So locked into place in that way for many. That's a valid point. We want it to be... If you look at a 5-year-old, 5-year-olds are able to, oh, I'll try that. Oh, how about that? Go with that. And then at some point at age, I don't know, who knows, 40, 55, oh, I'm trapped in this mode of this. But then the 5-year-old would look at you like, why? And then you're like, oh, stop asking me all these questions. At some point, you stopped answering the questions to yourself in a way.
Right.
I thought I'd point out, if I asked ChatGPT, this is for entertainment purposes, if I asked ChatGPT, label our talk such that it would be well received by the public and clicked on, it would say something like, Robert crushes Armin on immigration. Armin retires from reading. So, very substantial. Then people are like, oh my gosh, he crushed him on immigration. He's retired from reading. Armin was reading a lot before that. So what have changed? With like a flame. There'll be a flame picture there. That's pretty cool. Professor Robert Talisse, I would like to thank you for having joined on this episode of the show, describing a bit from Civic Solitude, why democracy needs distance, and covering a few of the topics on there, including why we as individuals could benefit from reasoned debate, passion as well, discourse, taking account of the others in a collective partnership such that there can be furtherance for the whole, all the demographics. Wonderful. And glad to have you on.
Thank you for having me. It's been really nice to talk to you. Thank you for reading the book.
Glad to. And we are out.